Long before history learned how to write its own name, before calendars, borders, or remembered kings, there was a silence beneath the jungle. Not an empty silence, but a heavy one, the kind that feels aware of itself. Imagine standing alone in a vast green world where the air is thick with moisture, where vines hang like slow-moving curtains, and where the ground beneath your feet has swallowed entire centuries without leaving a trace. Now imagine that deep under that soil, something is waiting. Stone faces, enormous, watching, waiting for someone to notice that they were never meant to be forgotten. What kind of people carve monuments that can outlive memory itself, then vanish so completely that even their name disappears? The rainforest does not answer quickly. It never does. Leaves rustle softly, insects hum like distant echoes of an older world, and time seems to stretch, slow, and bend. This is a land where the Olmecs once lived, though for thousands of years, no one knew that name. For generations, farmers passed by strange stones protruding from the earth. Children climbed them without knowing they were touching faces older than civilization as they understood it. The jungle kept its secret well. There is something unsettling about that idea, that an entire world can rise, flourish, shape the future of humanity, and then quietly slip back into the soil as if it never existed. No final warning. No dramatic collapse written in flames. Just silence. The kind of silence that makes you wonder how fragile memory truly is. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the world as it was over 3,000 years ago. No cities as we know them. No empires stretching across maps. The night sky is darker, heavier with stars, untouched by artificial light. Fires flicker softly in scattered settlements, and the sounds of nature dominate everything. Somewhere in the lowlands of what is now southern Mexico, people gather near rivers that overflow with life and danger in equal measure. They do not know they are ancient. They do not know they are the beginning of something vast. They are simply living. Yet beneath their ordinary lives, something extraordinary is taking shape. The first hint that this story will not follow familiar paths comes not from words, but from stone, massive blocks of volcanic rock, each weighing as much as several elephants combined, somehow transported across swamps and rivers without wheels, metal tools, or beasts of burden. And carved into these stones are faces, calm, stern, unmistakably human. Their lips are full, their eyes heavy-lidded, their expressions unreadable. They do not smile. They do not threaten. They simply exist, as if aware that time itself will eventually come looking for them. When these heads were first uncovered by modern eyes, disbelief followed. How could people so ancient create something so monumental? Why would they? And why were they buried, toppled, and scattered, as if intentionally hidden away? The jungle offers no easy explanations. It only grows. Slowly, patiently, covering stone with moss, history with roots, memory with soil. It is very good at erasing footsteps. This is where the story truly begins, not with certainty, but with absence, with gaps where answers should be, with questions that echo louder precisely, because no one was there to write them down. The Olmecs left no surviving books, no clear records, no voices that speak directly to us. Everything we know about them has been pieced together from fragments. Broken statues, half-buried platforms, patterns in art, and the quiet alignment of sacred spaces. And yet, from these fragments, a presence emerges. Calm, powerful, mysterious. They were not simply another early society. They were something closer to a foundation, a deep root from which later civilizations would unknowingly draw strength. Ideas about gods, rulers, ritual, and the structure of the universe itself seemed to ripple outward from them, appearing centuries later among the Maya and the Aztecs, transformed but familiar. It is as if the Olmecs whispered something into the soil and the land remembered, but memory fades. Even whispers disappear if no one listens. Picture an Olmec dawn. Mist rises in the rivers as the sun slowly warms the earth. The air smells of wet soil and leaves. Somewhere nearby, stone tools strike rock with dull rhythm. Children watch. Elders observe. No one knows that this moment will someday matter to people far removed in time, speaking languages not yet imagined. To them, this is simply life, work, belief, survival, and meaning woven together without separation. There's a quiet dignity in that simplicity, and also a quiet tragedy, because at some point the fires went out. Ceremonial centers fell silent. The paths through the jungle grew over. The great stone faces were toppled, buried, were left staring at nothing but sky and rain. And the world moved on, unaware of what it had lost. For centuries, the Olmecs existed only as shadows beneath the ground. Not legends, not myths, just absence. And perhaps that is what makes their story so powerful. They remind us that history is not a straight line of progress and remembrance. It is fragile, uneven, filled with forgotten brilliance. As you settle into the story, let the pace slow. There is no rush here. The Olmecs waited thousands of years to be rediscovered. They can wait a little longer to be understood. What matters now is not having all the answers, but learning how to listen to the jungle, to the stone, and to the quiet spaces where an entire lost world still breathes beneath the surface of time. Because once you realize how completely a civilization can vanish, it becomes impossible not to wonder what traces of us will remain when the forest grows back. To understand the Olmecs, it helps to loosen your grip on the idea of time as something neat and orderly. Forget centuries neatly stacked like books on a shelf. In their world, time did not march forward in straight lines. It flowed like water, circling back on itself, rising and falling with the seasons, stretching endlessly into the past without clear beginnings. This was a world before dates mattered, before years were counted, before anyone thought to record their place in history. And yet, this was not a primitive world in spirit. It was a world filled with observation, memory, and meaning. Imagine standing at the edge of a river that has been flowing for thousands of years longer than any human life. The people who lived beside it did not see it as scenery. It was a living presence, a moving force that shaped when they planted, when they traveled, when they prayed. Floods arrived without warning. Fertile soil followed destruction. Nothing was permanent, and nothing was random. To the Olmecs, the rhythm of the land was the closest thing to a clock they needed. This deep relationship with time set them apart from how we often imagine ancient societies. There were no written calendars etched into stone at this stage, no list of kings carved into walls to anchor events. Memory lived in people, in rituals, in stories repeated beside firelight. Knowledge was passed through watching and doing, not reading. A child learned the world by moving through it, feeling its dangers and gifts firsthand. The past was not something separate from the present. It was always near, always present, layered into daily life. What makes this era so difficult for modern minds to grasp is precisely what makes it fascinating. We are used to measuring importance by documentation. If something is not written down, it feels unreal. But the Olmecs existed long before writing became a necessity. Their achievements unfolded quietly, without the need to announce themselves to the future. They had no reason to believe that thousands of years later, strangers would be searching the jungle for traces of their existence. And yet, when archaeologists began to peel back the layers of soil, they realized something astonishing. The Olmecs were already building complex societies at a time when much of the world was still experimenting with basic settlement. They were shaping stone, organizing labor, creating religious systems, and developing artistic styles that would echo far beyond their own lifespan. All of this happened in an age that feels almost invisible on traditional timelines. This realization brings with it a subtle sense of discomfort. If a civilization this influential can be almost completely erased from common memory, what does that say about the way history is preserved? It suggests that much of humanity's story has already been lost, not destroyed, but simply never recorded in ways we recognize. The Olmecs remind us that history is selective, and silence does not mean absence. In their world, the night sky carried more weight than any written record. Stars rose and fell with dependable patience. The moon waxed and waned, pulling tides and moods along with it. These patterns were watched closely, not with scientific instruments, but with reverence. Time was experienced, not measured. The future was not planned decades ahead. It was felt through cycles. Rain would return, crops would grow, life would continue, and eventually everything would end. There's a quiet humility in living that way. When survival depends so directly on nature, arrogance has little room to grow. The Olmecs did not see themselves as masters of the land. They were participants in it. This perspective shaped the way their society developed. Power, when it emerged, was often tied to spiritual authority rather than conquest. Leaders were not just organizers. They were mediators between visible and invisible forces. As we drift deeper into this early moment of human history, it becomes clear that the Olmecs did not think of themselves as standing at the beginning of anything. They were not laying foundations for future civilizations in their own minds. They were responding to the needs and mysteries of their own time. The fact that later cultures would inherit and adapt their ideas was an unintended consequence, not a goal. This challenges the modern tendency to view early civilizations only in terms of what they led to. When we frame the Olmec solely as a mother culture, we risk overlooking the fullness of their own lived experience. Their world was complete unto itself. It had meaning, structure, beauty, fear, and hope, regardless of what came after. Picture an Olmec elder speaking to a younger generation as the sun sets. The stories told are not about distant ancestors in abstract terms, but about places, animals, spirits, and events that still feel close. The boundary between myth and memory is soft. A jaguar seen in the forest may carry the weight of both danger and divine presence. A storm is not just weather. It is intention. Time, in this sense, is layered. The past walks alongside the present, unseen but felt. When we try to place the Olmecs neatly into a timeline labeled early, we impose perspective they never shared. For them, there was no early or late, only now and what had always been. Their sense of permanence did not come from stone monuments or written names, but from continuity. The belief that as long as rituals were performed and stories remembered, the world would remain in balance. And yet, balance is never guaranteed. At some point, subtle shift began to occur. Climate patterns changed. Rivers altered their paths. Soil exhausted itself. These changes were not sudden enough to feel catastrophic in a single lifetime, but over generations, they reshaped the possibilities of survival. The Olmecs adapted as long as they could, guided by the same cyclical understanding of time that had sustained them for centuries. What they could not anticipate was how completely their world would eventually fade from collective awareness. They did not imagine a future where their stone faces would lie buried, their cities swallowed, their name unknown. They trusted in the continuity they could see, not in distant futures they could not imagine. As you listen to this story unfold, it helps to let go of the urge to place everything in order. Instead, allow yourself to drift into their sense of time. Slow, repeating, deeply connected to the natural world. The Olmecs lived in a world where history did not need to be written to be real. It simply needed to be lived. And in that living, they created something enduring enough to survive silence itself, waiting patiently beneath the earth until someone much later would finally begin to listen. The land did not simply surround the Olmecs. It shaped them, guided them, tested them, and quietly decided what was possible and what was not. To understand their world, you must first feel the way of the place itself. The low, humid plains along the Gulf Coast where earth and water blur into one another. This was not a gentle landscape. It was alive, demanding constant attention, offering abundance only to those who learned its moods. The air here was thick, heavy with moisture that clung to skin and breath alike. Rain did not arrive politely. It poured, flooded, transformed familiar paths into rivers, and turned solid ground into sucking mud. Rivers swelled and shrank with the seasons, carving new routes through the land, sometimes bringing fertile silt, sometimes destruction. For the Olmecs, these rivers were both lifelines and threats, carrying food, trade, and meaning, while also reminding everyone how little control they truly had. Dense forests covered much of the region, their canopies filtering sunlight into shifting patterns of green and gold. Beneath the trees, life teemed in endless variation. Birds cried out at dawn. Insects hummed constantly, a background sound that never fully faded. Jaguars moved silently through the undergrowth, unseen but sensed. Snakes warmed themselves on fallen branches. Every step into the forest carried both promise and danger. To survive here required knowledge passed down through careful observation, trial, and memory. The soil, enriched by floods and volcanic activity, was fertile but unpredictable. Crops could flourish in one season and fail the next. Maize, beans, squash, and other plants formed the foundation of life, but their success depended on timing, rainfall, and careful tending. Agriculture was not merely labor, it was a relationship. The Olmecs watched the sky closely, reading clouds and winds, learning when to plant and when to wait. In this way, the land taught patience. Hidden beneath the surface was another gift: stone. Volcanic rock, dense and enduring, lay far from many Olmec settlements. Basalt, the material used for their most famous monuments, came from distant mountains. Reaching it meant navigating rivers, swamps, and forests without the benefit of metal tools or wheeled transport. The decision to use such stone was not practical in the modern sense. It was intentional. It suggests that the land itself was woven into their spiritual and social life, that certain materials carried meaning beyond convenience. Transporting massive stone blocks across such terrain was a feat that demanded cooperation on a scale rarely seen so early in human history. Logs, ropes, waterways, and human strength became tools of movement. Progress would have been slow, measured in days and weeks rather than miles. Each journey was an act of commitment, binding communities together through shared effort. The land made this work difficult, and in doing so, made it meaningful. The climate shaped not only survival, but belief. In a world where rain could bring life or ruin, weather took on spiritual significance. Storms were not random. They were messages, warnings, or signs of imbalance. Drought stirred fear and reflection. Floods reminded everyone of their vulnerability. Over time, these experiences gave rise to rituals meant to restore harmony between humans and the forces around them. The landscape became a sacred text, read through observation rather than words. Living in such an environment meant accepting uncertainty as a constant companion. The Olmecs could not rely on rigid plans or permanent structures alone. Adaptability was essential. Settlements shifted. Fields were abandoned and reclaimed. Homes were rebuilt. Nothing was fixed forever. This flexibility allowed them to endure for centuries, but also meant that much of their world was designed to blend back into the land when no longer needed. Even their cities reflected this relationship. Rather than imposing rigid grids, Olmec ceremonial centers often followed the contours of the land. Platforms rose from natural elevations. Plazas opened toward rivers or mountains. Architecture felt like an extension of the landscape rather than a challenge to it. Stone and earth were shaped, not conquered. The jungle itself acted as both protector and eraser. Its density discouraged invasion, shielding Olmec communities from distant threats. At the same time, when people moved on or populations declined, vegetation returned quickly. Paths disappeared. Structures crumbled. Within a few generations, even major centers could become indistinguishable from the surrounding forest. This quality of the land would later help conceal the Olmecs from history itself. Sounds in this environment were constant but subtle. Water dripping from leaves, wind moving through branches, distant animal calls. Silence, as we imagine it, rarely existed. Instead, there was a steady hum of life. At night, the darkness was deep and complete, broken only by firelight and stars. Without artificial light, the sky dominated the senses, reinforcing connection between earth and heavens. The land did not end at the horizon. It extended upward into the cosmos. The Olmecs learned to read this world with care. Tracks in mud told stories of animals and people. Changes in bird behavior hinted at storms. The taste of water signaled safety or danger. Knowledge was practical, but it was also layered with meaning. The environment was not separate from culture. It was culture. This closeness to the land fostered a worldview in which humans were one element among many, not rulers above all else. Survival depended on balance, taking enough, but not too much, honoring forces beyond control, understanding limits. When that balance held, life continued. When it faltered, consequences followed. Over generations, this landscape shaped Olmec identity in ways that went far beyond geography. It influenced how they organized labor, how they expressed power, how they imagined the universe. Their art reflects animals that shared their world. Their symbols echo natural forms. Their monuments carry the weight of the earth from which they came. As you imagine this land, let it feel vast and intimate at the same time. Picture muddy feet, damp air, and the steady rhythm of water moving through the world. This was the stage upon which the Olmecs lived, dreamed, and built. It was unforgiving, generous, mysterious, and alive. And long after people themselves were gone, the land remained. Patient, quiet, ready to cover their traces and keep their secrets, until someone much later would begin to listen again to what the earth had been holding all along. Before there were monuments, before stone faces emerged from the earth, there were people simply trying to make sense of their days. The first Olmecs did not awaken with the knowledge that they would one day be remembered or forgotten or studied. They woke to the same concerns that have shaped human life everywhere: hunger, safety, family, and a quiet hope that tomorrow will be manageable. Their story begins not with grandeur, but with small decisions repeated over generations. Imagine a cluster of homes made from wood, clay, and thatch, gathered close to a river's edge. Smoke rises gently from cooking fires as the morning air begins to warm. Children stir from sleep. Elders sit quietly, listening to the sounds of forest, gauging what kind of day it will be. There is no sharp division between work and ritual here. Every action carries meaning, whether or not it is spoken aloud. The earliest Olmec communities formed gradually, drawn together by the promise of fertile land and reliable water. Families settled where the soil was rich and fish were plentiful, where the forest provided wood, game, and protection. These were not massive settlements at first. They were modest, flexible, able to shift when floods came or resources grew scarce. Survival favored those who observed carefully and adapted quickly. Life followed the rhythms of the land. Planting, harvesting, fishing, hunting, and gathering blended into a continuous cycle. Tools were simple but effective: stone blades, wooden implements, woven baskets. Skill mattered more than speed. Knowledge was shared through demonstration and repetition, passed from one pair of hands to another. There were no written rules, but there was expectation, tradition, and memory. Over time, something subtle began to change. As communities grew larger and more stable, cooperation became more complex. Tasks required coordination beyond immediate family groups. Clearing fields, managing water, organizing seasonal work. These efforts encouraged new forms of leadership. At first, leadership may not have looked like authority in the modern sense. It was likely rooted in experience, wisdom, and the ability to interpret signs from a natural and spiritual world. Certain individuals gained respect not because they commanded, but because they understood. They knew when floods were coming, how to heal wounds, how to interpret dreams, how to speak to forces unseen. Their guidance helped communities survive uncertainty. Slowly, these figures became central points around which social life organized. As populations increased, settlements began to cluster more tightly. Shared spaces emerged, areas for gathering, for ritual, for exchange. These spaces were not designed for spectacle. They were practical and symbolic at once, reinforcing the sense that the community was more than a collection of individuals. It was a living whole. With this growth came identity. The people who lived here began to see themselves as connected not just by blood, but by place. The land shaped them, and they belonged to it. Stories emerged explaining origins, relationships with animals, and the forces governing the world. These stories did not need to be written. They lived in repetition, performance, and shared understanding. Children grew up surrounded by these narratives, absorbing them without realizing it. They learned which animals were dangerous, which were sacred, which were both. They learned which places to avoid and which to approach with respect. Knowledge was layered. Practical lessons carried spiritual weight, and spiritual beliefs reinforced practical behavior. As identity strengthened, so did expression. Objects became more than tools. They carried symbols, marks of belonging, and hints of belief. Simple figurines appeared, carved from stone or shaped from clay. Faces emerged, not portraits of individuals, but representations of something shared. These early expressions hint at the deeper artistic tradition that would later define Olmec culture. Trade, too, began quietly. Nearby communities exchanged goods and knowledge, creating networks of movement and influence. a piece of stone from a distant region, carried with its stories of travel and connection. These exchanges expanded the Olmecs' understanding of the world beyond their immediate surroundings, without diminishing their attachment to home. There was no single moment when the Olmecs became a civilization, no dramatic turning point. Instead, there was accumulation of experience, of shared memory, of cooperation. Over generations, small choices created patterns. Patterns created structure. Structure created continuity. This gradual rise is easy to overlook because it lacks spectacle, but it is precisely this quiet persistence that made the Olmecs resilient. Their society was not imposed suddenly. It grew organically, shaped by necessity and belief rather than ambition alone. The absence of rigid hierarchy in the early stages allowed flexibility, a valuable trait in an unpredictable environment. Even as complexity increased, daily life remained grounded. People still woke with the sun. They still felt the rain on their skin and the weight of humidity in the air. They still relied on one another in ways that left little room for isolation. Community was not an abstract idea. It was survival. As you imagine these first Olmec people, try not to see them as distant or strange. See them as familiar. Parents worried about children. Elders hoped their knowledge would endure. Young people tested boundaries, learned skills, dreamed of futures they could not fully articulate. The difference lies not in emotion, but in context. They lived without the illusion of permanence. Structures decayed. Landscapes shifted. Lives were fragile. And yet, within that fragility, they built something enduring, a shared way of understanding the world that would, in time, give rise to monuments, rituals, and ideas far larger than any one person. This is how the Olmecs began, not with dominance, but with presence, not with conquest, but with cooperation. Their lost world was not born overnight. It emerged slowly, carried forward by countless ordinary lives, each leaving a subtle imprint on the land, trusting that what mattered would continue, even if no one remembered their names. At some point, the quiet balance of early Olmec life began to shift, not abruptly, not with conquest or collapse, but with a slow gathering of people, ideas, and purpose in one place. The land itself seemed to invite this change. In a region where rivers crossed fertile ground and elevated ridges offered refuge from floods, a settlement began to grow larger than the others. Over time, it would come to be known as San Lorenzo, though the people who lived there had no such name for it. To them, it was simply the center, a place where the rhythms of life converged. As generations passed, the settlement transformed. What had once been clusters of homes became an organized landscape of platforms, open spaces, and carefully shaped earth. Labor was no longer limited to family groups. It required coordination across the community. Stones were moved. Ground was leveled. Pathways were cleared. These were not acts of survival alone. They were acts of intention. San Lorenzo did not rise because of force. There is little evidence of walls, weapons, or constant conflict. Instead, its power seems to have grown from its ability to organize people and resources on an unprecedented scale. Leadership here was subtle, rooted in influence rather than coercion. Those who guided the community likely did so by blending practical knowledge with spiritual authority, convincing others that their vision aligned with the balance of the world. The transformation of the landscape itself reflects this emerging order. Natural hills were reshaped into terraces. Drainage systems were engineered to manage water flow, preventing flooding and preserving soil. This level of planning suggests foresight, cooperation, and shared belief. People were willing to invest immense effort into shaping their environment, trusting that the outcome was worth the labor. As San Lorenzo grew, it began to draw people from surrounding areas, not as captives, but as participants. The settlement offered stability, protection from floods, and access to trade routes. It became a place where ideas circulated more freely, where specialized skills could develop, some focus on stoneworking, others on ritual, others on agriculture or trade. This specialization marked a turning point. Society was becoming layered. With layers came distinction. Certain individuals occupied elevated spaces, physically and symbolically. Platforms rose above the surrounding land, separating ritual and leadership from everyday life. This separation did not necessarily mean inequality as we understand today, but it did create hierarchy. Power was becoming visible. It is during this period that the first colossal heads likely took shape. Their emergence is inseparable from the rise of San Lorenzo. These massive sculptures did not appear in isolation. They were products of an organized society capable of mobilizing labor, resources, and artistic vision. The faces carved into stone suggest authority, perhaps representing rulers or revered ancestors. Their calm expressions hint at confidence, not aggression. Imagine the impact of seeing one of these heads for the first time. Rising from the earth, massive and immovable, it would have altered how people understood leadership. Authority was no longer just spoken or remembered. It was carved into the landscape itself, enduring beyond any single lifetime. Power had become permanent. Yet even as power centralized, it remained intertwined with belief. Leadership at San Lorenzo was likely inseparable from ritual responsibility. Those at the center were expected to maintain harmony between people, land, and unseen forces. Failure to do so would not simply weaken political control. It would threaten the balance of the world as they understood it. Daily life for most people continued much as before, planting, harvesting, crafting, raising families. But the presence of the center changed everything subtly. Work now contributed to something larger. Ritual calendars influenced labor cycles. Ceremonies reinforced shared identity. San Lorenzo was not just a place. It was a symbol of collective purpose. Trade expanded as well. Goods from distant regions flowed into the center. Obsidian, jade, rare stones. These materials carried prestige and meaning. Their presence reinforced the authority of those who controlled their distribution. Power was expressed not only through monuments, but through access. Despite this growing complexity, there is little sign of constant warfare or oppression. The rise of San Lorenzo appears to have been relatively stable, suggesting that its authority was broadly accepted. This acceptance likely rested on the belief that the center served the community's spiritual and material needs. As long as floods were managed, crops grew, and rituals were performed, the system held. But such systems are always delicate. Environmental shifts began to test this balance. Changes in river courses, soil erosion, and resource strain placed pressure on the settlement. Maintaining large populations and monumental projects required constant effort. The same organization that had enabled San Lorenzo's rise now demanded more from the land and the people. Over time, signs of stress appeared. Some monuments were deliberately damaged or buried. Water management systems failed or were abandoned. These actions suggest not sudden destruction, but conscious change. Perhaps leadership lost legitimacy. Perhaps beliefs shifted. Perhaps the land itself refused to cooperate any longer. San Lorenzo's decline did not erase its influence. The idea of centralized power, monumental art, and sacred leadership had already taken root. Other centers would rise, learning from its successes and failures. The story of San Lorenzo is not one of simple rise and fall, but of transformation. As you imagine this place, let it feel alive but heavy with effort. Hear the sounds of stone being shaped, water flowing through channels, voices gathered in ritual. This was a turning point in human organization, a moment when quiet communities learned to act as one, guided by belief, necessity, and the subtle emergence of power carved into the land itself. There are moments in history when an object speaks louder than any surviving word, when its presence alone forces questions that refuse to settle. For the Olmecs, those moments are carved in stone. Imagine walking through dense jungle, the air thick and quiet, when suddenly the shape of a human face emerges from the earth. Not small, not fragile, massive, unavoidable, a face that should not exist, staring out from a time so distant it barely feels real. The first encounter with an Olmec colossal head is never neutral. Even now in museums or cleared archaeological sites, their scale overwhelms. In their original setting, surrounded by forest and silence, the effect would have been profound. These were not decorative objects. They were statements, placed deliberately to be seen, to be felt. Their weight alone suggests permanence in a world where little was permanent. Each head is carved from a single block of basalt, transported from far-off volcanic mountains. The effort required to move such stone across swamps and rivers, without metal tools or wheels, borders on the unimaginable. And yet, the Olmecs did it not once, but many times. This alone tells us something essential. These faces mattered deeply. Look closely at their features. Broad noses, full lips, heavy eyelids, helmets or headgear carved with subtle variation. No two faces are exactly alike. This detail matters. These are not generic gods or symbols. They feel individual, almost personal. Many scholars believe they represent rulers, leaders whose authority was immortalized in stone. Others suggest revered ancestors, guardians watching over sacred spaces. Whatever their identity, they were meant to be recognized. Their expressions are calm, composed, and controlled. There is no smile, no fear, no anger, just presence. This emotional restraint is powerful. It suggests a concept of authority that is steady rather than violent, confident rather than aggressive. Power, in the Olmec world, did not need a shout. And yet, there is an unsettling quality to these faces. Their size distorts familiarity. They are human, but not comfortably so. They watch without blinking. They endure without aging. Standing before one, it is easy to feel small, temporary, exposed. Perhaps that was part of their purpose. Where these heads were placed also matters. Many were positioned in ceremonial centers, aligned with plazas or pathways. Some appear to have been moved, toppled, or buried intentionally. This suggests changing meanings over time. A ruler revered in one generation may have been replaced, forgotten, or symbolically laid to rest in another. Stone may endure, but power does not. The act of carving these heads was not merely artistic. It was ritual. Shaping stone required patience, precision, and time measured in months or years. Each strike of a tool was deliberate. The process itself would have been witnessed, remembered, and perhaps sanctified. The creation of a head may have marked a ruler's ascension, a significant event, or a transition in leadership. Imagine the community gathered as the final details are smoothed. The face emerges slowly from the raw block, as if being revealed rather than created. This moment would have carried weight, a transformation from inert stone into something alive with meaning. Once placed, the head became part of the landscape, altering how space was experienced. The helmets worn by the figures add another layer of mystery. They resemble protective gear, possibly linked to ritual ball games or ceremonial roles. These details hint at a society where leadership, sport, ritual, and identity were intertwined. The headgear distinguishes the figures, marking them as separate from ordinary life. What is perhaps most striking is that the Olmecs did not stop at one. 17 colossal heads have been discovered so far, spread across different sites. This repetition suggests tradition, not anomaly. It was important enough to repeat, refine, and sustain across generations. The knowledge of how to create them was preserved, taught, and valued. And yet, for all their grandeur, these heads were eventually abandoned. Some were damaged, others buried. Some reused as building material. This challenges the idea that they were meant to be eternal symbols. Instead, they seem to have been part of a living tradition, subject to change as beliefs evolved. When their purpose ended, they were allowed to return to the earth. This return is deeply symbolic. The Olmecs did not cling to monuments, as we often do. They allowed stone to be reclaimed by soil. Perhaps this reflects a worldview in which nothing, not even power, was meant to last forever. Everything moved in cycles: rise, presence, decline, renewal. The rediscovery of these heads centuries later feels almost like an intrusion. They were not left for us. They were left for the land. When modern eyes first saw them, confusion followed. Some early interpretations were shaped by bias, misunderstanding, and projection. But as study deepened, respect replaced speculation. Today, these faces have become icons of the Olmec world. They appear in books, museums, and imagination, but their true power remains quiet. They do not tell us their names. They do not explain their purpose. They simply endure, inviting reflection rather than offering answers. As you imagine these stone faces in their original setting, surrounded by jungle and ritual space, consider the experience of those who stood before them long ago. They would have felt the weight of continuity, the presence of leadership made permanent, the connection between human life and something larger. And perhaps that is why these heads still affect us. They remind us that long before written history, people understood how to express power, memory, and identity in ways that transcended words. They carved meaning into stone, trusting that even if their voices were lost, their presence would remain. In the end, these faces are not just remnants of a lost civilization. They are witnesses, silent, patient, watching as centuries pass, asking nothing, offering everything, and reminding us that the past is never as distant as it seems when it can still look directly back at us. Behind every colossal stone face lies a story that cannot be seen in the finished form alone. It is a story of hands pressed against rough basalt, of aching muscles, of patience stretched across seasons. The Olmec monuments feel immovable and timeless, but their creation was anything but effortless. They were born from human endurance, shaped not by machines or metal, but by persistence and shared will. Imagine the moment when a suitable stone was first identified in the distant volcanic highlands. It did not announce itself as a future monument. It was simply part of the mountain, silent and heavy. Choosing it would have required vision, the ability to see a face within raw rock, long before the first tool struck its surface. That choice alone marked the beginning of a journey that would take months, perhaps years. Extracting such stone was dangerous work. Without metal tools, Olmec workers relied on stone hammers and wedges, gradually freeing the massive block through repeated impact. The sound of stone striking stone would have echoed to the landscape, rhythmic and relentless. Progress would have been slow, measured in inches rather than feet. Each crack in the rock would have been both victory and warning. Once freed, the true challenge began. Transporting a block weighing many tons across uneven terrain was a feat of coordination unlike anything attempted before. There were no wheeled carts, no draft animals. The land itself became the pathway. Rivers were used as natural highways. Logs served as rollers. Ropes made from plant fibers strained under unimaginable tension. Human bodies became the engines of movement. Picture dozens, perhaps hundreds, of people working together, pushing, pulling, guiding. Movement would have been incremental. A single mistake could undo days of effort. In swamps, the ground would give way unexpectedly. In forests, roots and stones would block progress. Each obstacle demanded problem-solving in the moment. There was no blueprint, only experience and adaptation. This labor was not forced in the sense of later empires. It was communal. Participation in such work likely carried social and spiritual meaning. To help move a stone destined for ritual or leadership representation was to contribute to something larger than oneself. The effort itself reinforced unity. Shared struggle became shared identity. When the stone finally reached its destination, it was not yet recognizable. The carving process was equally demanding. Stone tools chipped away at the surface bit by bit. Mistakes could not be easily corrected. The sculptors needed deep familiarity with the material, understanding how it fractured, how much pressure it could bear. This knowledge was learned over lifetimes, passed down quietly. Carving was not a solitary act. Others would have been present. Assistants, observers, apprentices. The process likely unfolded in stages, with rituals marking progress. The face emerged gradually, as if being uncovered rather than created. This slow revelation carried symbolic weight, reinforcing the idea that the figure already existed within the stone, waiting. The physical toll of this work cannot be overstated. Hands blistered, muscles strained, fatigue was constant, yet the work continued. This persistence suggests motivation beyond obligation. The monument mattered deeply enough to justify the cost. In a world where survival demanded daily effort, dedicating such energy to stone speaks volumes about values and belief. What is striking is the precision achieved despite limitations. Proportions are balanced. Features are deliberate. Symmetry is present but not rigid. These are not crude carvings. They reflect aesthetic standards and technical skill. The Olmecs were not experimenting blindly. They knew what they were doing. The organization required to support such projects extended beyond the carvers themselves. Food had to be provided, tools maintained, injuries treated. This implies a society capable of supporting specialized labor, even temporarily. The community invested in its artists, Recognizing their role as essential, this process also shaped social bonds. Those who worked together on a monument shared an experience few others did. They carried stories of effort, setbacks, and triumph. These stories would have been retold, reinforcing the significance of the finished work. The monument became a repository not just of power, but of collective memory. And yet, the Olmecs did not immortalize the makers themselves. No signatures remain. No names are carved into stone. The focus was not on individual achievement, but on the figure represented and the meaning it carried. This absence of personal credit reflects a worldview in which creation served something beyond the self. As time passed, techniques improved, knowledge accumulated. The ability to shape stone became part of cultural identity. This expertise later influenced other Mesoamerican cultures, spreading quietly through trade and contact. The hands that carved the giants left an imprint far beyond their own time. When the monuments were eventually abandoned or buried, the labor invested in them was not undone. It was simply allowed to return to the earth. This acceptance of impermanence is striking. The Olmecs understood that effort did not guarantee eternity. Meaning existed in the act, not just the outcome. As you imagine these hands at work, let the pace slow. Hear the steady rhythm of stone on stone. Feel the weight of effort stretched across days and nights. These were not faceless laborers. They were people, tired, determined, connected, shaping something that would outlast them without ever knowing how far into the future would travel. Through their work, the Olmecs demonstrated something profoundly human. The willingness to invest immense effort into symbols, beliefs, and shared identity, even when survival itself was never guaranteed. In the silent stone faces that remain, we see not just power, but the enduring imprint of countless unseen hands. As the influence of San Lorenzo slowly faded, the heart of the Olmec world did not stop beating. It simply shifted, drifting eastward toward a place where earth rose gently from the wetlands and where the horizon felt wider, more open. Here, surrounded by marshes and waterways, a new center emerged, quieter in appearance, yet deeper in meaning. This place would later be called La Venta, and unlike its predecessor, it did not present itself as a seat of raw authority. Instead, it felt like a carefully arranged conversation between humans, land, and the unseen. Approaching La Venta would have felt different from entering any ordinary settlement. The land itself seemed prepared, shaped with intention rather than force. Long earthen platforms rose from the ground, not abruptly, but with a softness that mirrored the natural contours of the region. Wide plazas opened into the sky, inviting gathering rather than control. Everything about the space suggested ritual over residence, symbolism over survival. This was not a city built to house thousands of people living their daily lives. It was a ceremonial landscape, a place designed for moments that mattered deeply, for transitions, offerings, alignment, and remembrance. People likely traveled here from surrounding communities, drawn not by power alone, but by belief. La Venta was a destination, not a refuge. At the center of this sacred landscape stood a massive earthen mound, rising higher than anything else in surrounding lowlands. From a distance, it would have seemed almost unnatural, a man-made mountain in a land otherwise shaped by water and forest. Yet its presence was not aggressive. It felt contemplative, as if the earth itself had been gently lifted toward the sky. Climbing this mound would have been an act of separation from the ordinary world. With each step, sound from below would fade. The air would feel different, lighter, more exposed. From the top, the view stretched across wetlands and waterways, the horizon dissolving into mist. It was a place to pause, to observe, to feel small beneath the sky. La Venta's layout followed patterns that were anything but accidental. Alignments with cardinal directions suggest careful observation of the sun and stars. Pathways guided movement in deliberate ways, shaping how people experience space and time within the site. Ritual processions likely followed these routes, reinforcing shared understanding through movement rather than words. Buried deep within the site were offerings that speak softly of devotion and sacrifice. Jade figurines arranged carefully beneath layers of clay. Polished stones placed with precision. These were not items meant to be seen again. They were gifts to the earth itself, acts of trust rather than display. The willingness to bury such valuable objects reveals a worldview in which meaning outweighed possession. Unlike San Lorenzo, where colossal heads stood as visible symbols of leadership, La Venta turned inward. Its power was subtle, hidden beneath layers of soil and symbolism. Authority here did not need to stare back at the people. It flowed quietly through ritual, alignment, and shared belief. This shift reflects a deeper transformation in Olmec society. As populations changed and environments evolved, so too did the ways people understood power. Leadership may have become more ceremonial, more spiritual. The role of mediators between worlds, shamans, priests, ritual specialists, likely grew in importance. La Venta feels less like a throne and more like a threshold. The surrounding wetlands added to the sense of liminality. Water reflected sky. Fog blurred edges. Boundaries between solid ground and fluid space were never fully stable. This environment reinforced the idea that reality itself was layered, that what was seen was only part of what existed. La Venta did not fight this ambiguity. It embraced it. Sound would have played a role here as well. Voices carried across open plazas. Drums and chants echoed softly against earthen walls. The absence of stone architecture meant that sound moved differently, less sharply, more diffusely. Rituals here were felt immersive, enveloping rather than commanding. At night, the experience would have deepened. Fires flickered low, casting moving shadows across the ground. The stars overhead felt close, almost reachable. Without tall structures to block the view, the sky became part of the ceremony. Movements of celestial bodies were not abstract concepts. They were visible companions. What is remarkable is how much of La Venta was designed to disappear. Earth and clay, unlike stone, are vulnerable to time. Rain erodes, plants reclaim. This choice of material suggests acceptance of impermanence. The sacred did not need to last forever to matter. It needed to be felt in the moment it was created. And yet, despite this vulnerability, La Venta endured for centuries. Its influence spread quietly, shaping religious ideas and ceremonial practices across Mesoamerica. Other cultures would echo its layouts, its symbolism, its understanding of sacred space. The power of La Venta lay not in dominance, but in resonance. When the site was eventually abandoned, it did not collapse in violence. There are no clear signs of destruction, no final stand. It simply grew quiet. Rituals ceased. Pathways were no longer walked. The wetlands moved closer. Soil settled. Plants returned. For generations, La Venta slept beneath layers of earth, its offerings untouched, its alignments unnoticed. Unlike stone monuments, it left little to catch the eye of passers-by. This invisibility protected it. What was hidden survived. To imagine La Venta is to imagine a place where belief was built into the ground itself, where movement, alignment, and silence carried meaning, where people gathered not to be ruled but to connect, to each other, to the land, and the forces they felt but could not name. As you let this image settle, allow the pace to slow. Picture mist drifting across open space. Feel the softness of earth beneath bare feet. Hear distant water and quiet voices. La Venta was not a city meant to impress. It was a place meant to transform, gently and deeply, leaving its imprint not on stone but on memory. And perhaps that is why it still speaks. Even now, not loudly, not clearly, but in a way that invites listening rather than certainty, reminding us that some of the most powerful centers in human history were never meant to stand forever, only long enough to be felt. To the Olmecs, the world was not divided into the natural and the supernatural. There was only one reality, layered and alive, where earth, sky, water, and spirit moved through one another constantly. Every sound carried intention. Every creature held meaning. The land was not simply occupied. It was inhabited by forces older and stronger than any human presence. To live here was to exist in relationship, not dominance. Their gods were not distant beings ruling from unreachable heavens. They were born from the landscape itself. Rain fell from heavy clouds, and so rain became a spirit. Rivers surged and withdrew, and so water carried will. The earth fed and swallowed, and so it was both giver and taker. In this world, divinity did not require temples of stone. It lived in mountains, storms, animals, and darkness. Among these sacred forces, one presence moved through Olmec belief with particular intensity: the jaguar. Powerful, silent, capable of killing without warning. The jaguar embodied everything the jungle represented. It moved between day and night, forest and river, life and death. To the Olmecs, the jaguar was not simply an animal. It was a bridge between worlds. Images of human figures merging with jaguar traits appear again and again in Olmec art. Faces with feline mouths. Children cradled by jaguar beings. Eyes that seem both human and something older. These are not monsters. They are transformations. They suggest a belief that identity was fluid, that humans could move closer to divine power through ritual, lineage, or altered states of consciousness. Rain, too, held deep spiritual weight. In a land where crops depended entirely on seasonal water, rain was life itself. When it failed to come, fear followed. When it arrived too violently, destruction came instead. Rain was unpredictable, and so it demanded respect. Over time, this reverence shaped the image of a rain deity, often depicted with infant-like features, perhaps symbolizing renewal and vulnerability. The Olmec universe was not a place of simple good and evil. It was a delicate balance. Too much rain was as dangerous as too little. Too much fertility could overwhelm. Too much power could unbalance the world. Ritual existed to restore harmony, not to dominate nature. This understanding shaped how the Olmecs approached the unseen. Shamans and ritual specialists acted as intermediaries, not commanders. Their role was to listen, to interpret signs, to guide the community through uncertainty. Dreams mattered. Visions mattered. Trance was not escape, but communication. The boundaries between waking life and the spiritual world were thin. Certain places felt charged: caves, springs, mountaintops, and ceremonial centers aligned with celestial events. Entering these spaces required preparation and respect. Time behaved differently there. Ordinary concerns faded, replaced by heightened awareness. The sky was another sacred realm. The movement of the sun and stars provided a sense of order in an unpredictable world. The rising and setting of celestial bodies mirrored cycles on Earth: growth, decay, death, and return. Observing these patterns did not require advanced instruments, only patience and attention. Over generations, these observations shaped ritual calendars and sacred alignments. Water, earth, and sky formed a triad of existence, each interacting with the others. The Olmecs did not separate them conceptually. Floods connected sky and land. Rivers carried the memory of rain. Caves pierced the earth, leading inward toward darkness and origin. These were not metaphors. They were lived realities. Sacred objects reflected this worldview. Jade, with its green hue, symbolized life, fertility, and renewal. Its smooth surface and durability made it ideal for ritual use. To bury jade was to return life energy to the earth, trusting in cycles rather than permanence. Obsidian, sharp and reflective, carried associations with transformation and danger. The gods of the Olmecs were not fixed personalities with detailed stories preserved in text. They were forces, shapes, presences felt more than described. This fluidity allowed beliefs to adapt as circumstances changed. New symbols could emerge without erasing old ones. Belief was dynamic, responsive. Fear and comfort coexisted in the spiritual landscape. The same forces that nurture could destroy. Appeasing them was not about obedience, but relationship. Offerings were gestures of respect, acknowledgments of dependence. The act mattered more than the display. Children grew up absorbing these beliefs without formal instruction. They learned by watching rituals, listening to stories, and observing how adults responded to natural events. A storm was not just weather. It was a moment of attention. A successful harvest was not luck. It was balance restored. This worldview fostered humility. Humans were not central. They were participants. Their actions mattered because they affected the balance, not because they granted control. This perspective shaped leadership, art, and daily life in subtle ways. As you imagine the spiritual world, let it feel immersive rather than defined. Picture shadows shifting at the edge of firelight. Hear rain approaching before it falls. Feel the weight of watching the sky for signs. The Olmec gods were not distant myths. They were present companions, woven into every aspect of existence. This intimacy with the unseen gave the Olmec strength and vulnerability. When harmony held, life flourished. When it faltered, fear followed. Yet even fear carried meaning. It reminded people of their place within something vast and alive. In this way, Olmec belief was not about escaping the world, but understanding it deeply. Their gods were reflections of the land they lived on, shaped by water, earth, and sky. And though their names are lost, their presence still lingers, felt in stone, in symbol, and in the quiet understanding that long before words recorded belief, humans found ways to listen to the world and respond with reverence. In the Olmec world, there were individuals who walked a path slightly apart from the rest, not above, not beyond, but between. These were the shamans, the ones believed to move freely across boundaries that others could only sense from a distance. They did not rule through force or decree. Their power came from perception, from the ability to listen to what the world whispered beneath its surface. From an early age, certain people may have shown signs that set them apart. Intense dreams, sensitivity to sound and shadow, a way of seeing patterns where others saw chaos. These signs were not feared. They were watched. Over time, those individuals were guided, taught to understand their experiences rather than be overwhelmed by them. The path of a shaman was not chosen lightly. It demanded discipline, restraint, and deep trust from community. Training was immersive and long. Knowledge was passed not through instruction alone, but through experience. Shamans learned the properties of plants, those that healed, those that opened the mind, those that could harm if used without respect. They learned the language of the body and the subtle signals of imbalance. They learned when to act and, just as importantly, when to remain silent. Ritual was a framework through which shamans moved between worlds. Ceremonies were carefully timed, often aligned with celestial events or seasonal changes. Preparation mattered. Fasting, isolation, and purification helped quiet the ordinary senses, making space for deeper awareness. The goal was not escape, but clarity. Altered states of consciousness played a central role in this process. Through rhythmic sound, movement, breath, and sacred substances, shamans entered states where the boundaries of self softened. In these moments, transformation became possible. Human identity blurred with animal, spirit, and landscape. This was not seen as illusion. It was revelation. Art offers glimpses into these experiences. Figures carved in stone appear mid-transformation. Mouths partway between human and jaguar, eyes wide and unfocused, limbs caught in motion. These images are not decorative. They are records of journeys taken and returned from. They capture moments when the shaman stood at the threshold. In trance, time behaved differently. The past and future felt closer, layered into the present. Messages arrived not as words, but as sensation, symbol, and emotion. Interpreting these messages required skill. Not everything seen was meant to be shared. Discernment was essential. The community relied on shamans during moments of uncertainty. Illness, drought, conflict, and transition all called for guidance. A shaman did not promise control over outcomes. Instead, they sought understanding, what had shifted, what balance had been disturbed, what action might restore harmony. Their role was to interpret, not command. Healing was as much spiritual as physical. Illness was often understood as imbalance rather than invasion. Treatment addressed the whole person, including their relationships with others and the environment. Rituals reinforced communal support, reminding individuals that they were not alone in their suffering. The shaman's relationship with animals was particularly significant. The jaguar, once again, stood as the most powerful ally. To embody the jaguar in trance was to borrow its strength, stealth, and authority. But other animals mattered too. Birds for vision, serpents for movement between realms, amphibians for transformation. Each carried specific meaning. These animal associations were not symbolic in the modern sense. They were lived. A shaman did not imagine becoming a jaguar. They experienced it. This belief shaped how identity was understood. The self was not fixed. It could expand, contract, merge, and return. Shamans also acted as historians in a world without writing. Through story, ritual, and repetition, they preserved memory. Important events were embedded in ceremony rather than text. In this way, History remained alive, adaptable, and connected to present needs. Despite their influence, shamans did not stand apart from daily life entirely. They lived among the people, shared in labor, and experienced the same vulnerabilities. Their power depended on trust. If guidance failed repeatedly, confidence eroded. Authority was earned continuously, not assumed. This balance kept the role grounded. Shamans were respected, but not untouchable. They served the community, not themselves. Their success was measured by harmony, not dominance. As you imagine this path, let it feel quiet and demanding rather than dramatic. Picture long nights spent listening to the forest, watching shadows shift, waiting for understanding to emerge. Picture rituals unfolding slowly, deliberately, without urgency. The shaman's work required patience and humility. In a world without clear answers, the ability to sit with uncertainty was a form of wisdom. Shamans embodied the skill. They stood where fear and wonder met, guiding others not toward certainty, but toward balance. Even after the Olmec world faded, echoes of the shamanic tradition persisted. Later cultures carried forward the idea of intermediaries between worlds, adapting it to new beliefs and circumstances. The path did not disappear. It transformed, and perhaps that is the lasting lesson of the shaman's role. Not that answers can always be found, but that listening, deep, attentive listening, has value in itself. In the Olmec world, to listen was to survive, to heal, and to remain connected to a reality far larger than any single life. In the Olmec world, balance was never assumed. It had to be maintained, renewed, and carefully protected. The forces that sustained life were powerful, but they were also unpredictable, and the Olmecs believed that harmony between humans and the unseen required constant attention. This understanding shaped some of the most solemn and misunderstood practices, rituals that, from a modern distance, can feel unsettling, but within their own world carried deep meaning. To the Olmecs, life itself was sacred precisely because it was fragile. Blood was not viewed as something shameful or violent by nature. It was life force, movement, warmth, and connection. It carried breath, memory, and presence. To offer blood was not simply to lose something, but to give back a portion of what had been received. In this way, sacrifice was framed not as destruction, but as exchange. These rituals did not arise from cruelty or disregard for life. They emerged from fear, reverence, and responsibility. When rains failed, when crops struggled, when illness spread or floods destroyed fields, the Olmecs did not see random misfortune. They saw imbalance. Something had shifted. Something needed to be addressed. Ritual offerings were a way to speak to forces that could not be controlled directly. Just as gifts strengthened human relationships, offerings were believed to restore trust and attention from the divine. The act mattered as much as the substance. Preparation, intention, and restraint were essential. Nothing about these ceremonies was casual. In many cases, offerings involved personal sacrifice rather than death. Bloodletting, performed through controlled and symbolic acts, allowed individuals, often leaders or ritual specialists, to offer part of themselves without ending their lives. These moments were quiet, deliberate, and deeply private. Pain was not the goal. Commitment was. More severe rituals, including human sacrifice, were rare and surrounded by strict ceremonial context. When they occurred, they were likely tied to moments of extreme crisis or transition. The individuals involved may have been chosen according to specific beliefs, perhaps seen as messengers, intermediaries, or embodiments of renewal rather than victims in the modern sense. This does not erase the weight of such acts. Even within Olmec belief, these moments would have been heavy, filled with gravity and silence. Ritual spaces became places where ordinary rules paused, where the community confronted its dependence on forces beyond understanding. Fear and hope coexisted closely here. The setting of these rituals mattered deeply. Ceremonial centers, caves, and sacred platforms created separation from daily life. Entering these spaces signaled a shift in awareness. Participants prepared themselves mentally and spiritually, understanding that what occurred there carried lasting consequences. Offerings were not always meant to be seen again. Objects of great value, jade, figurines, polished stone, were buried deliberately. Once placed, they were left untouched. This act of letting go reinforced trust in cycles rather than possession. what was given was no longer owned. Children grew up aware of these practices without necessarily witnessing them directly. Stories and symbols conveyed their importance. Respect for ritual was learned early, not through fear, but through understanding that survival depended on maintaining balance. The emotional atmosphere surrounding these ceremonies was restrained. There is little evidence of spectacle or excess. The Olmecs did not dramatize sacrifice. They approached it with solemnity. Silence, repetition, and controlled movement dominated. This restraint reflects a worldview that valued harmony over display. Leadership played a crucial role here. Those in positions of authority were expected to bear greater responsibility. Their willingness to offer themselves symbolically reinforced legitimacy. Power was tied to sacrifice, not indulgence. To lead was to give, not merely to command. This perspective challenges modern assumptions about ancient power structures. The Olmec elite were not insulated from risk. They were bound more tightly to ritual obligation. Failure to maintain balance could undermine their authority quickly. Archaeological evidence supports this interpretation. Signs of deliberate burial and careful placement suggest intention rather than chaos. These were not acts of desperation performed without thought. They were structured, repeated, and embedded within belief systems that emphasized order. Understanding these practices requires stepping outside modern moral frameworks without abandoning empathy. It is possible to acknowledge discomfort while recognizing that the Olmecs operated within a worldview radically different from our own. Their choices were shaped by survival, belief, and a sense of cosmic responsibility. Importantly, sacrifice was not constant. It was not the defining feature of daily life. Most days were ordinary, filled with work, family, laughter, and rest. Ritual punctuated life rather than consumed it. This distinction matters. The Olmecs did not dwell on death for its own sake. Their focus was renewal. Blood returned life to the earth. Offerings nourished unseen forces. Ritual marked endings, so that beginnings could follow. Even the most solemn ceremonies pointed forward, not backward. Over time, these practices influenced later Mesoamerican cultures, where sacrifice became more visible and, in some cases, more frequent. But the Olmec approach appears more restrained, more symbolic. Their legacy lies not in excess, but in the idea that maintaining balance sometimes requires profound commitment. As you reflect on this aspect of Olmec life, allow space for complexity. These rituals emerge from a deep awareness of vulnerability. They were attempts to negotiate with a world that offered no guarantees. In a landscape shaped by floods, droughts, and unpredictable forces, ritual provided structure and meaning. The quiet lesson beneath these practices is not one of violence, but of responsibility. The Olmecs believed that actions mattered beyond the immediate moment, that what was given, even at great cost, could restore harmony. That survival was a shared effort between humans and the unseen. In this way, sacrifice was not an end, but a gesture, one rooted in humility, fear, and hope. And though the world they knew has long since faded, the question they grapple with remains familiar. What are we willing to give to preserve balance in a world that never fully rests in our control? Long before roads were carved into maps or borders drawn across land, movement defined connection. For the Olmecs, the world did not end at the edge of their settlements. It extended outward along rivers, through forests, across mountains, carried quietly by people who walked, paddled, and remembered the way back. Trade was not merely an exchange of objects. It was a movement of ideas, beliefs, and influence, flowing gently through regions that would later give rise to entire civilizations. The rivers were the first pathways. Wide, slow-moving, and unpredictable, they connected distant communities like veins through the land. Canoes glided across their surfaces, loaded with goods wrapped carefully against water and time. Travel was never easy. Currents shifted. Storms appeared suddenly. But rivers offered something rare in dense jungle: direction. They guided movement, shaped routes, and carried stories along with stone and jade. Obsidian traveled these routes. Its sharp, glass-like surface prized for both practical and ritual use. It came from volcanic regions far beyond the Olmec heartland, passing through many hands before reaching its destination. Each piece carried a history of movement, a silent record of cooperation across distance. Jade, even more valued, moved slowly and deliberately. Its green glow symbolized life, fertility, and renewal. To possess jade was to hold a fragment of something sacred. But trade was never only about materials. With each exchange came conversation, observation, imitation. Pottery styles shifted subtly. Symbolic motifs appeared in new places. Religious ideas echoed across regions, adapted to local landscapes and beliefs. The Olmecs did not impose their worldview through conquest. Their influence spread because it resonated. Travelers acted as bridges between worlds. They carried news of distant lands, different rivers, unfamiliar animals, new ways of living. These stories expanded the imagination of those who stayed behind. The world grew larger, not through maps, but through narrative. Knowledge of distant places was layered onto existing beliefs, enriching rather than replacing them. Trade networks also reinforced social structure. Access to exotic materials enhanced status, but it also carried responsibility. Those who controlled distribution were expected to use it wisely, reinforcing balance rather than hoarding power. Objects gained meaning through context. A jade bead was not valuable because it was rare alone, but because of the relationships and journeys embedded within it. Movement through unknown territory required trust in guides, in shared customs, in hospitality. Encounters between groups were delicate moments. Language differences existed, but gestures, offerings, and ritual behaviors helped bridge gaps. Trade encouraged diplomacy long before formal agreements existed. Over time, certain routes became familiar, repeated, remembered. Campsites formed along the way. Sacred places emerged where travelers paused to give thanks or seek protection. These pauses created a rhythm of movement that shaped regional interaction. The land itself learned the paths. Through trade, the Olmecs became quietly central. Their artistic styles and symbolic language appeared far beyond their core territory, not as copies, but as adaptations. Other communities took Olmec ideas and reshaped them, blending them with local traditions. Influence became layered, not uniform. This diffusion created a shared cultural vocabulary across Mesoamerica. Certain symbols began to carry similar meanings in distant regions. The jaguar motif, the emphasis on sacred rulership, the idea of balance between worlds, all traveled gently through exchange rather than force. Trade also carried risk. Journeys exposed travelers to illness, injury, and conflict. Weather could erase progress. Goods could be lost. Yet people continued to move. The rewards outweighed the dangers. Connection mattered. Within Olmec centers, these networks reinforced a sense of belonging to something larger. The presence of distant materials reminded communities that they were part of an interconnected world. This awareness shaped identity. The Olmecs were not isolated pioneers. They were participants in a growing web of human interaction. As generations passed, these networks strengthened. Younger travelers learned routes from elders. Stories accumulated. Knowledge of seas and currents and safe passage became refined. Trade evolved from experimentation to tradition. Even when Olmec political centers declined, these routes did not vanish. They persisted, carrying influence forward. Later civilizations inherited not only objects, but pathways of connection already worn into the land. The Olmecs did not disappear from the network. They became part of its foundation. What is striking is how quietly this influence operated. There were no proclamations, no monuments marking borders. Trade left few physical traces, yet its impact was profound. It shaped how cultures understood power, ritual, and identity. As you imagine these journeys, let them unfold slowly. Picture paddles dipping into dark water, footsteps pressing into mud, goods wrapped carefully, carried with care. Hear the sound of unfamiliar voices meeting at riverbanks. These moments of contact, repeated countless times, stitch together a vast and subtle world. The Olmecs may have built monumental centers, but their greatest reach traveled lightly, on water, on foot, in shared belief. Through trade, their lost world extended far beyond its visible boundaries, leaving echoes in places they would never see, carried by people who remembered the way. Long after the great Olmec centers grew quiet and their ceremonial spaces slipped back into the embrace of earth and vegetation, their presence did not vanish. It lingered, subtly and persistently, like a rhythm that continues even after the sound has faded. Later civilizations would rise across Mesoamerica, believing themselves new, distinct, and independent. Yet beneath their foundations lay ideas first shaped centuries earlier by the Olmecs. This is why they are often called the mother culture, though the term itself can feel too simple for something so layered and organic. The Olmecs did not leave behind an empire defined by conquest or borders. Instead, they left patterns, ways of seeing the world, of organizing society, of expressing belief. These patterns were not imposed. They were adopted, adapted, and transformed by those who came after. Influence, in this sense, was not a chain of command, but a shared inheritance. One of the clearest legacies lies in the concept of sacred rulership. Among later Mesoamerican societies, leaders were not merely political figures. They were mediators between humans and the divine, responsible for maintaining cosmic balance. This idea did not appear fully formed out of nothing. Its roots can be traced back to Olmec representations of authority. Figures carved in stone, calm and composed, embodying a fusion of power and spirituality. The notion that leadership carried ritual obligation rather than unchecked privilege became a defining feature of the region. Rulers were expected to perform ceremonies, offer sacrifice, and demonstrate alignment with cosmic forces. Failure to do so could undermine their legitimacy. This model of leadership, deeply entwined with belief, echoes the Olmec worldview. Artistic traditions also reveal this continuity. The visual language developed by the Olmecs, bold forms, symbolic abstraction, the blending of human and animal features, reappears in modified forms across centuries. The jaguar motif, for example, remains central in later cultures, symbolizing power, transformation, and the liminal space between worlds. Though styles evolved, the underlying meanings persisted. Architectural choices further reflect Olmec influence. The organization of ceremonial centers with plazas, platforms, and alignments tied to celestial observation became a shared blueprint. Later societies refined and expanded these designs, building in stone rather than earth. But the spatial logic remained familiar. Movement through sacred space continued to matter as much as the structures themselves. Even the Olmec approach to time left its imprint. The emphasis on cycles, of seasons, of life and death, of cosmic renewal, became central to Mesoamerican thought. Calendrical systems developed later, but the underlying belief in repeating patterns was already present. Time was not a straight line moving toward an end. It was a circle, constantly renewing itself. Religion, too, carried forward Olmec foundations. Deities associated with rain, fertility, maize, and transformation appear across cultures, bearing different names but similar attributes. The Olmec understanding of divinity as embedded in natural forces shaped how later societies interacted with their environment. Ritual remained a means of relationship rather than domination. The spread of writing and symbolic systems also owes something to Olmec experimentation. While the extent of Olmec writing remains debated, early symbols and iconography suggest attempts to encode meaning visually. Later writing systems may have drawn inspiration from these early efforts, refining them into more structured forms. What makes this legacy remarkable is its quietness. There is no single moment when one can say, "Here, the Olmecs pass the torch." Instead, their influence appears gradually, woven into the fabric of emerging cultures. This diffusion allowed ideas to survive even as political centers changed. The Maya, in particular, exhibit strong continuity with Olmec traditions. Their art, cosmology, and ceremonial practices echo earlier patterns while introducing new complexity. The Aztecs, arriving much later, would look back on ancient sites with reverence, interpreting them through their own beliefs. The Olmecs became ancestors not through direct lineage, but through shared cultural memory. It is important to recognize that this influence was not static. Later cultures did not simply copy Olmec ideas. They reinterpreted them to suit new environments, challenges, and social structures. This adaptability is part of what made the Olmec legacy durable. Ideas that could evolve were more likely to endure. Trade networks played a crucial role in this process. As discussed earlier, the movement of goods facilitated the movement of ideas. A jade figurine or carved symbol carried not just aesthetic value, but conceptual meaning. As these objects moved, so did the beliefs attached to them. The concept of balance between humans and nature, between worlds seen and unseen, remained central across Mesoamerica. This shared emphasis shaped responses to crisis, governance, and ritual. Even as societies grew larger and more complex, this foundational belief continued to guide action. Calling the Olmecs a mother culture risks oversimplifying their role, suggesting a single origin for diverse traditions. In reality, their influence was part of a broader dialogue among early societies. They contributed significantly, but they also learned, adapted, and evolved alongside others. Their legacy is collaborative rather than hierarchical. This perspective matters because it honors the agency of later cultures while acknowledging deep roots. It avoids turning the Olmecs into mythical founders detached from reality. Instead, it places them within a living continuum of human creativity and adaptation. As you reflect on this legacy, imagine ideas traveling through time not as fixed doctrines, but as seeds. Some fall on fertile ground and flourish. Others change shape. Some fade. The Olmecs scattered many such seeds, not knowing where they would land or how they would grow. Their lost world did not end with abandonment. It transformed, dissolving into the cultures that followed. Even today, when we study Mesoamerican civilizations, we trace patterns that lead back to those early experiments in power, belief, and expression. In this way, the Olmecs never truly disappeared. They became part of a larger story, one that continues to unfold as we learn to recognize their influence not as a relic of the past, but as a foundation upon which others built, reshaped, and imagined new worlds. The Olmecs lived in a world where memory did not depend on ink or paper. Long before words were fixed into lines, meaning traveled through images, gestures, and repetition. Knowledge was not stored in books or monuments meant to be read aloud centuries later. It lived in the body, in ritual, in objects shaped carefully to hold more than their physical form. This makes their relationship with symbols especially intriguing, because what remains suggests a people standing at the edge of written expression, experimenting with ways to preserve thought without fully committing it to text. Carved stones, polished jade, and etched surfaces reveal patterns that feel deliberate rather than decorative. Repeated motifs appear across distant sites. Faces with specific features, symbols tied to animals, abstract shapes placed with intention. These were not random marks. They were part of shared visual language, understood by those who live within it, even if its grammar now escapes us. Some of these symbols seem to represent authority or lineage. Others appear tied to ritual moments, cosmic forces, or transformation. The fact that they recur across regions suggests shared understanding, even in the absence of standardized writing. Meaning did not require spelling when context was enough. One of the most compelling discoveries associated with the Olmecs is evidence that they may have been among the first in Mesoamerica to experiment with proto-writing. Certain inscriptions, carved into stone or etched into small objects, resemble structured communication rather than pure imagery. They hint at an early attempt to record information, perhaps names, events, or sacred concepts. These symbols are rare and fragmentary. They do not form long texts. They do not explain themselves. And yet, their very existence suggests a shift in how knowledge was perceived. The desire to fix meaning beyond spoken memory marks a turning point. It reflects awareness that stories, rituals, and authority might outlast individuals if given a more permanent form. But permanence was never absolute in the Olmec world. Even these early symbols were often buried, hidden, or placed where they would not be seen regularly. This suggests that writing, if it existed, was not meant for public display or broad communication. It may have been sacred, restricted, or symbolic rather than practical. In this sense, Olmec symbols function less like writing as we know it and more like keys, objects that unlock meaning only for those already initiated. Understanding did not come from reading alone, but from participation in shared belief systems. Symbols reinforce memory rather than replacing it. The Olmecs also relied heavily on oral tradition. Stories passed through generations carried history, cosmology, and instruction. These narratives were not fixed. They adapted with each telling, shaped by the needs of the present moment. This flexibility allowed belief to remain relevant, but also meant that nothing was preserved exactly as it once was. This reliance on living memory explains both the richness and fragility of Olmec knowledge. When communities dispersed or centers declined, Stories faded. Rituals changed. Without written records to anchor them, details slipped away. What survived did, so through influence rather than documentation. The silence left behind can feel frustrating to modern minds trained to seek clarity through text. We want dates, names, explanations. The Olmecs offer instead fragments and impressions. Their symbols invite interpretation but resist certainty. This ambiguity is not a failure. It reflects a worldview in which meaning was layered and contextual, not fixed and universal. Consider how a carved face might function as both art and record. It could represent a leader, a lineage, a moment in time. Its placement within a ceremonial space might encode information about social structure or cosmology. To those who lived there, these meanings were obvious. To us, they are shadows. The same applies to spatial symbolism. The layout of ceremonial centers communicated ideas about order, direction, and cosmic alignment. Movement through these spaces was a form of reading, one that used the body rather than the eye alone. Knowledge was experienced rather than decoded. Even numbers, which later became central to Mesoamerican calendars, may have begun as symbolic concepts rather than mathematical tools. Patterns of repetition, cycles of ritual, and alignment with natural events formed numerical understanding grounded in observation rather than abstraction. The Olmecs did not need writing to build complex society. Their symbols, stories, and rituals were sufficient for coordination, belief, and continuity. Writing, when it appeared, was not a necessity but an experiment, one possibility among many for preserving meaning. This perspective challenges modern assumptions about progress. We often view writing as a clear dividing line between prehistory and history, between simplicity and complexity. The Olmecs complicate this narrative. They demonstrate that complexity can exist without text, and that writing is not the only path to sophisticated thought. Later cultures would take the symbolic groundwork laid by the Olmecs and develop more formal writing systems. The Maya, in particular, expanded visual symbolism into a fully articulated script capable of recording history, astronomy, and ritual. In this way, Olmec experimentation became a foundation rather than a finished product. What remains poignant is how much was never written down. Names of rulers, stories of migration, personal experiences. Entire lifetimes of thought vanished with the people who held them. This loss is not unique to the Olmecs, but their early position in history makes it especially visible. And yet, absence itself becomes a kind of message. It reminds us that history is incomplete, shaped as much by what survives as by what disappears. The Olmecs did not intend to be mysterious. They lived fully in their present. Mystery arises only because we arrive too late. As you sit with this silence, imagine knowledge held in gestures, in shared glances, in ritual movements repeated year after year. Imagine stories that lived as long as they were needed, then faded naturally. There's a quiet elegance in this impermanence. The Olmecs trusted memory more than material. They trusted people more than objects. Writing, when it appeared, did not replace this trust. It supplemented it briefly, then receded again into the earth. What we are left with are symbols that refuse to speak clearly, inviting patience rather than certainty. They remind us that understanding the past requires humility, that some knowledge was never meant to survive outside the world that created it. And perhaps that is the final lesson of Olmec silence. Not everything needs to be written to matter. Not every truth seeks permanence. Some meanings live fully, then dissolve, leaving behind only the faint impression that something important once passed through here, understood deeply by those who were present, and never meant to be fully explained to anyone else. Nothing in the Olmec world ended with a single moment of collapse. There was no final battle, no burning city frozen in time, no clear line marking the end of their dominance. Instead, their power loosened its grip slowly, like something exhaled after being held for too long. The unraveling was quiet, gradual, and deeply human. For generations, the systems that sustained Olmec life had worked because the land cooperated just enough. Rivers flooded but receded. Rain arrived in time for planting. Soil recovered after use. But nature is never obligated to remain consistent, and over long stretches of time, small changes accumulate. River courses shifted, subtly at first, then decisively. Fields that once yielded abundance became unreliable. Floods grew more destructive, or droughts lingered longer than memory could recall. To a people who understood the world as a balance of forces, these changes were not meaningless. They were messages. Something had shifted. Something was no longer aligned. At first, the response would have been ritual. More offerings, more careful observance of signs, adjustments in ceremony and leadership. When systems have worked for centuries, the instinct is not to abandon them, but to deepen commitment. The Olmecs did not panic. They adapted, as they always had. But adaptation has limits when pressure comes from multiple directions at once. As environmental stress increased, maintaining large ceremonial centers became more difficult. Feeding specialized workers required surplus, and surplus became harder to guarantee. The same organization that once enabled monumental projects now strained resources. Social cohesion, once reinforced by shared success, faced quiet tension. Leadership, deeply tied to spiritual responsibility, came under scrutiny. If rulers and ritual specialists were meant to maintain cosmic balance, then imbalance called their authority into question. This did not necessarily lead to rebellion in the modern sense. It may have led to doubt, withdrawal, and gradual disengagement. Evidence suggests that some Olmec monuments were deliberately damaged, buried, or repurposed. This was not random destruction. It feels intentional, symbolic. Burying a monument could mark the end of its relevance, a closing of a chapter rather than an act of anger. Power was not overthrown violently. It was laid to rest. People began to move, not all at once, not in desperation, but steadily. Smaller settlements became more appealing than large centers vulnerable to environmental instability. Families followed rivers, sought new land, joined or formed communities better suited to changing conditions. Movement did not erase identity. It transformed it. This dispersal weakened centralized authority without erasing cultural memory. Ritual practices continued in new forms. Beliefs adapted. What had once been concentrated in places like San Lorenzo and La Venta diffused into the wider landscape. The Olmec world did not collapse inward. It spread outward. From a distance, this process can look like decline, but from within, it may have felt like survival. It is important to remember that the Olmecs did not think in terms of historical legacy. They did not measure success by endurance across millennia. They measured it by continuity of life, by balance restored, by children growing and seasons returning. When centers no longer served those purposes, letting them go was not failure. It was acceptance. The earth itself reclaimed what humans released. Earthen platforms softened under rain. Forests advanced. Stone monuments sank or were covered deliberately. Paths faded. Within a few generations, places that once held thousands of people could feel distant, even to descendants who lived nearby. Memories shifted from place to story. The names of specific centers may have faded, but the ideas they represented endured. Sacred space did not vanish. It relocated to new hills, new rivers, new clearings shaped by belief rather than architecture. Trade networks continued, though their focus shifted. Influence did not end. It changed hands, moved through different communities, and took new forms. The Olmecs ceased to exist as a centralized culture, but their worldview lived on in fragments, carried forward by those who inherited parts of it. There's a quiet dignity in this kind of ending. No dramatic fall, no forced erasure, just change, unfolding slowly enough that life could adjust. From the perspective of archaeology, this gradual unraveling can be frustrating. There is no single layer of ash to mark the end, no final inscription to explain why things changed. But this absence tells its own story. It suggests resilience rather than collapse, movement rather than destruction. The Olmecs did not vanish overnight. They became something else. Their descendants likely blended into emerging cultures, contributing knowledge, belief, and practice without insisting on recognition. Identity was fluid. Names changed. Traditions merged. What mattered was continuity, not preservation of a label. This process reminds us that civilizations are not organisms that live or die whole. They are patterns of behavior, belief, and organization. Patterns can dissolve and reappear in new forms. The Olmecs exemplify this truth. As you imagine this period, let it feel slow and uncertain rather than tragic. Picture families choosing to leave familiar ground, carrying tools, stories, and memory with them. Picture ceremonies performed one last time in places that would soon grow quiet. Picture stone faces buried gently, not in shame, but in closure. The unraveling of Olmec power was not an ending carved in stone. It was a soft release, shaped by environment, belief, and choice. And in that release, they ensured that what mattered most would not be trapped in a single place or time. Their world did not disappear. It changed its shape, leaving behind traces not always visible, but deeply embedded in the cultures that followed. After people leave, the land does not remain empty for long. It waits, quietly and patiently, then begins its slow work of reclaiming what was once shaped by human hands. In the Olmec world, abandonment did not mean destruction. It meant silence, followed by growth. Cities did not collapse in fire or fall beneath invading armies. They simply stopped being used. And in the humid lowlands where the Olmecs lived, stillness is an invitation for nature to return. At first, the changes would have been subtle. Footpaths used daily grew softer under rain. Weeds pushed through compacted earth. Wooden structures, already vulnerable, began to sag and rot, returning to soil within years. Fires no longer burned in hearths. The sounds of voices faded, replaced by insects and wind. What had once felt alive with movement began to feel distant, even to those who remembered it. Stone endured longer, but even stone could not resist the landscape forever. Earthen platforms softened as rain loosened their edges. Mounds lost their sharp lines, becoming gentle rises indistinguishable from natural hills. Water pooled where drainage systems once guided it away. The careful order imposed by human intention blurred into organic irregularity. The jungle moved quickly. Vines crept over exposed surfaces. Roots worked their way into cracks, widening them slowly, patiently. Trees took hold where plazas once opened to the sky. Within decades, visibility diminished. Within centuries, the forest closed completely, sealing what remained beneath layers of green. This process was not violent. It was calm, persistent, inevitable. Nature did not erase the Olmecs out of anger or indifference. It absorbed them, the way it absorbs everything that pauses long enough. The land did not distinguish between sacred space and ordinary ground. It treated all equally. For those who left, returning to these places after years would have felt unsettling. Familiar landmarks softened or vanished. Sacred centers lost their clarity. Without constant upkeep, meaning became harder to read. Eventually, even memory faded. Younger generations heard stories of places they had never seen, and over time, those stories changed or disappeared entirely. The great stone monuments fared differently. Too heavy to be carried away, they remained where they were placed or where they fell. Some were intentionally buried, covered with soil as part of ritual closure. Others were toppled and left exposed, their faces turned toward the sky. Rain washing over them season after season. Moss and lichen grew, softening features that once appeared sharp and deliberate. From a distance, these stones no longer announced themselves as human creations. They blended into the landscape, becoming strange hills or irregular outcrops. Without context, their purpose was unreadable. They waited. This waiting lasted longer than anyone could have imagined. Generations came and went. New cultures rose elsewhere, built their own centers, followed their own rhythms. The Olmec heartland became just another stretch of forest, its past concealed by growth. Animals moved through abandoned spaces without awareness of what had been there before. Jaguars passed between buried platforms. Birds nested where ceremonies once unfolded. Water carved new paths through what had once been carefully shaped ground. The land continued its cycles, indifferent to human memory. There is something humbling in this return. The Olmecs built with care and intention, but they did not build to defy nature forever. Their choice of materials, earth clay, would suggest an acceptance of impermanence. Even their stone monuments, though durable, were allowed to be reclaimed. They did not attempt to preserve their world against time at all costs. In this way, abandonment was not failure. It was part of the same cycle that governed everything else. Growth. flourishing, decline, renewal. The Olmecs understood this rhythm deeply. Their worldview made room for endings without catastrophe. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of life, just not human life. And in that silence, the past was not destroyed. It was hidden. When later people moved through these regions, they sometimes encountered traces without understanding them. A carved stone here, an unusual mound there. These remnants were incorporated into new beliefs, seen as the work of ancestors or spirits. The original context was lost, but a sense of reverence remained. This layering of meaning adds to the quiet persistence of Olmec presence. Even forgotten, they were not erased. Their works continue to shape how the land was perceived, how certain places felt different, heavier, charged. From a perspective of modern archaeology, this long period of abandonment creates both challenge and wonder. So much was lost to decay, and yet so much survived precisely because it was left alone. Hidden sites avoided destruction by later development. Buried offerings remained untouched. Silence became preservation. As you imagine this era, allow the pace to slow even further. Picture rain falling steadily over an empty plaza, leaves collecting where feet once moved, stone faces gradually disappearing beneath vines. Time stretches here, measured not in years, but in centuries. There is no grief in this image, only acceptance. The Olmecs did not cling to permanence. They trusted cycles. Their cities were not meant to last forever. Their meaning did not depend on visibility. When the forest reclaimed their world, it did not erase their existence. It held it quietly waiting, and that waiting would last long enough for the world to forget what lay beneath its roots, until, much later, human curiosity would return and the silence would begin to speak again. For a very long time, nothing happened, or at least, nothing that left a mark meant to be remembered. The forest grew, seasons passed, rivers shifted their courses again and again, carving new paths through land that no longer held human intention. The Olmec world settled into a silence so complete that even its absence became normal, not forgotten deliberately, not erased by force, simply unspoken. Centuries turned quietly into more centuries. Children were born, grew old, and died without ever knowing the names of people who once shaped the land beneath their feet. Stories thinned, then vanished. What remained were impressions without explanations, a mound that felt oddly shaped, a stone that did not belong, a place where the ground felt different, heavier somehow. But without context, these impressions were not history. They were curiosities, easily ignored. The jungle does not preserve memory the way stone walls or dry deserts do. It absorbs. Heat, moisture, and life itself work constantly to soften edges and blur outlines. What disappears first, then earth reshapes itself, and eventually even stone begins to feel natural again. In this environment, time does not announce itself. It drifts. During this long silence, other cultures rose and fell beyond the Olmec heartland. New cities emerged elsewhere in Mesoamerica. New gods were named. New calendars counted time in cycles, and numbers the Olmecs never wrote down. These later societies stood on inherited ground, without always knowing whose footsteps came before theirs. Some encountered remnants of the Olmec world and folded them into their own understanding. A carved stone face might be seen as an image of an ancestor or a god, or a being from a distant age. A mound might be treated as sacred without anyone remembering why. In this way, fragments of Olmec presence survived not as history, but as myth. But even myths fade if they are not renewed. Eventually, even these faint associations dissolved. The land became just land again. Forests thickened. Wetlands expanded and contracted. Wildlife reclaimed every open space. The Olmec centers existed only as buried shapes beneath the surface, indistinguishable from the world around them. This kind of disappearance is difficult for modern minds to accept. We are accustomed to ruins that announce themselves, broken columns, visible walls, inscriptions that demand interpretation. The Olmecs left almost nothing like that above ground. Their silence was nearly total. It is tempting to see this silence as loss alone, but it is also a kind of preservation. Because the Olmec world was not continuously occupied, it avoided the kind of destruction that comes from constant rebuilding. Later societies did not dismantle their cities to reuse stone, because most of what remained was already hidden. The forest became a shield. During this long quiet, the Olmecs ceased to exist as a distinct people. Their descendants blended into new identities, carrying pieces of belief and practice without necessarily recognizing their origin. Culture does not disappear all at once. It diffuses. It softens. It becomes part of something else. Language changed. Ritual adapted. Names shifted. What had once been uniquely Olmec became simply human, absorbed into the broader tapestry of Mesoamerican life. This process left no clear boundary between past and present. The Olmecs did not end. They dissolved. The world above their buried cities grew increasingly unfamiliar. Climatic patterns changed slowly. Vegetation evolved. Animals migrated. The environment that later archaeologists would encounter was not the same one the Olmecs knew. Even the land itself forgot its earlier shape. And yet, beneath this forgetting, something remained intact. Not in memory, but in matter. Stone faces lay in darkness. Jade offerings rested undisturbed. Earthworks retained their alignment. The physical record slept, patient and silent, waiting without intention. This waiting had no awareness. It was not anticipation. It was simply time doing what time does when no one is watching. Human awareness returned gradually and at first, without understanding. Farmers clearing land occasionally uncovered strange stones. Workers stumbled upon objects that did not resemble anything familiar. These discoveries were isolated, disconnected, often dismissed. Without a narrative, objects remained mute. It took a long time for curiosity to grow strong enough to ask deeper questions. Even then, answers did not come easily. The Olmecs had left no guide, no explanation, no name carved into stone saying, "We were here." Modern recognition would have to be assembled from fragments scattered across space and time. Before that recognition, there was simply silence. This silence carries particular weight. It forces us to confront how much of human history exists without witnesses. How many worlds have risen and fallen without leaving traces we know how to read. The Olmecs remind us that history is not a complete record. It is a selection shaped by survival, environment, and chance. For thousands of years, the Olmecs existed only as potential, unknown, unrecognized, buried. They were not part of the story humanity told itself. They were not included in timelines or taught as origins. They were not remembered as ancestors. They were simply gone. And yet their absence did not erase their influence. Patterns seeded long ago continue to grow elsewhere. Ideas outlive their creators. Sacred concepts adapted to new forms. The Olmec contribution persisted invisibly, embedded so deeply that it no longer needed a name. This is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of their silence. That something can matter profoundly without being remembered. That impact does not require recognition. As you imagine this long, quiet stretch of time, let it feel vast and slow. Picture centuries passing without interruption. No one speaks the Olmec language. No one performs their rituals in their original form. No one repairs their monuments. And yet, the world continues. Rain falls. Sun rises. Crops grow in other places. People live full lives unaware that beneath the ground lies a forgotten civilization that once shaped the future they now inhabit. There is no tragedy here in the dramatic sense. No final lament. Just continuity without awareness. The Olmecs did not haunt the land. They rested within it. When modern archaeology eventually begins to listen, to dig, to observe, to question, it will feel like an awakening. But before that moment, there's only this long silence, stretching across millennia, reminding us that forgetting is not an exception in human history. It is the rule. And in that rule, the Olmecs are not unique. They are simply one of the few forgotten worlds whose silence was deep enough and long enough to still be heard when someone finally stopped to listen. The silence did not break all at once. It cracked slowly, unevenly, in moments that seemed insignificant at the time. A farmer's tool struck stone where stone should not have been. A clearing revealed an earthwork too deliberate to be natural. A face emerged from soil, not gently, but abruptly, as if startled by the light. The rediscovery of the Olmecs did not begin with certainty or celebration. It began with confusion. In the 19th century, explorers, travelers, and local workers moving through the humid lowlands of southern Mexico encountered objects they could not explain. Massive carved stones lay half-buried in jungle terrain, their scale immediately unsettling. These were not the remains of known civilizations. They did not resemble the ruins of the Maya or the Aztecs, whose descendants were still remembered, still named. There was no story attached to these faces, no local memory that reached far enough back to explain them. At first, the discoveries were isolated. A single stone head near Traceapotes, another strange carving in a different region. Each was documented briefly, then set aside. The world was not yet ready to listen carefully. Without context, without a framework, these finds were curiosities rather than revelations. Early interpretations were often shaped by the biases of their time. Some observers struggled to accept that such monumental works could have been created by an ancient indigenous civilization. Speculation filled the gap where evidence was thin. Fantastical theories emerged, projecting foreign origins onto the stones rather than acknowledging local ingenuity. These ideas said more about the observers than the objects themselves. But the stones endured scrutiny the same way they had endured centuries of rain and roots. Quietly, as archaeology matured as a discipline, methods improved. Excavation became more systematic. Patterns began to emerge. Sites once thought unrelated revealed shared artistic styles, materials, and spatial organization. The idea of a single, coherent culture began to form, not imposed from imagination, but assembled from evidence. It was during this period that scholars began to understand just how old these remains were. The realization was unsettling. These monuments predated the Maya. They belonged to a time so early that it challenged established timelines of civilization in the Americas. The past suddenly stretched deeper than expected. Naming the culture was itself an act of reconstruction. With no surviving self-designation, archaeologists borrowed a term from later Nahuatl-speaking peoples, calling them the Olmecs, meaning roughly people of the rubber land. The name was imperfect, an approximation layered onto a reality it could never fully capture, but it gave the silence a label, a way to be spoken about. Excavations expanded. La Venta, San Lorenzo, Traceapotes. Names began to surface, attached to places that had slept beneath vegetation for centuries. Earthworks were revealed carefully, layer by layer. Offerings were uncovered exactly as they had been placed, untouched since burial. Jade figurines emerged, still arranged with intention. Each discovery carried with it a strange tension. On one hand, there was excitement, the thrill of unveiling something long hidden. On the other, there was humility. These objects had not been lost. They had been left alone. Rediscovery felt less like conquest and more like interruption. The colossal heads, once unearthed fully, demanded attention. Their scale defied easy explanation. Moving them to museums required modern machinery, a reminder of the immense effort their creators had once invested without such tools. Standing before them, archaeologists felt the weight of time press inward. Questions multiplied faster than answers. Who were these people? How did they organize their society? Why did they abandon their centers? What did they believe? Each artifact offered clues, but no complete picture. The Olmecs resisted being reduced to a simple narrative. As research continued, interpretations shifted. Scholars began to see continuity rather than anomaly. Olmec influence appeared in later cultures not as coincidence, but as inheritance. What had once seemed isolated now felt foundational. Yet the rediscovery was never complete. Every excavation revealed how much had already been lost to decay. Organic materials, wood, textiles, food were gone. Voices were gone. What remained were fragments strong enough to survive humidity and time, but incomplete by nature. Local communities played a quiet role in this rediscovery. Farmers, laborers, and residents often guided archaeologists to sites known informally, passed down through practical knowledge rather than historical understanding. This collaboration blurred the line between discovery and remembrance. The land had never fully forgotten. It had simply waited for recognition. Modern technology added new layers of insight. Aerial surveys revealed hidden earthworks beneath forest canopy. Chemical analysis traced the origins of stone and jade. Radiocarbon dating refined timelines. Each tool extended perception without replacing interpretation. Despite these advances, the Olmecs remained elusive. There was no moment when the past suddenly became clear. Understanding grew incrementally, unevenly. Certainty was always partial. This partiality shaped a different kind of respect. Rather than claiming mastery over the past, scholars learned to accept ambiguity. The Olmecs could not be fully recovered. They could only be approached. Public awareness followed slowly. Museums displayed Olmec artifacts. Textbooks adjusted timelines. The idea of a deep, complex pre-Maya civilization entered broader consciousness. But even then, the Olmecs often remained overshadowed by the cultures that followed them. Their rediscovery did not transform them into familiar figures. It highlighted their strangeness. The faces carved in stone did not smile for modern audiences. They did not explain themselves. They watched unchanged. There is something deeply moving about this encounter between modern curiosity and ancient silence. The Olmecs did not leave messages for us. They did not anticipate being studied. Their world existed fully without an audience. That independence gives their remains a kind of dignity. As you imagine archaeologists brushing soil from carved stone, pause on the intimacy of that moment. Hands separated by thousands of years meet indirectly. One shaped the object. The other reveals it. Between them lies time, unbridgeable and yet briefly connected. Rediscovery is not resurrection. The Olmecs did not return. What returned was awareness, a recognition that something important had once existed where no one had been looking. The silence did not vanish. It gained context. And even now, with decades of research behind us, the Olmecs remain partially hidden. New discoveries continue to reshape understanding. Old theories are revised. The story remains unfinished. Perhaps that is fitting. A civilization that did not seek permanence in memory cannot be fully captured by it. The rediscovery of the Olmecs is ongoing, a process rather than an event. In bringing their world back into conversation, modern observers have learned as much about themselves as about the past, about assumptions, limits of knowledge, and the patience required to listen across time. The forest once kept the Olmecs hidden. Now, scholarship listens where silence once reigned, not to conquer the past, but to acknowledge it. And in that acknowledgement, the Olmecs stand once more, not fully revealed, but no longer entirely forgotten. Once the Olmecs re-entered human awareness, they did not return quietly. Their silence, broken after so long, created a vacuum that people rushed to fill. Where evidence was incomplete, imagination stepped in. Where certainty was slow, speculation moved quickly. The Olmecs became not only a subject of study, but a mirror for modern hopes, fears, and misunderstandings about the ancient past. It is almost inevitable. When a civilization emerges without written records to explain itself, people begin to explain it for them. Early interpretations struggle with scale and age. The colossal heads, in particular, unsettled expectations. How could a society so ancient produce monuments of such size and precision? For some observers, the simplest answer felt impossible, that indigenous peoples of the Americas had achieved this on their own. Instead, theories appear that push the Olmecs outside their own land and time. Some claimed African origins, pointing to facial features they believed resembled their own ideas of African identity. Others suggested contact with lost continents, ancient seafarers, or civilizations erased from known history. Still others imagined influences from distant parts of the world, carried across oceans long before such journeys were thought possible. These ideas were often framed as admiration, but they carried a deeper problem. They denied the Olmecs' agency. They replaced evidence with projection. Rather than asking how society might grow complex within its own environment, these theories assume complexity must come from elsewhere. Archaeology does not move this way. It builds slowly, piece by piece, grounded in material context and comparison. Over time, evidence made it increasingly clear that the Olmecs were local, indigenous, and deeply rooted in Mesoamerica. Their art evolved from earlier regional traditions. Their materials came from nearby landscapes. Their influence spread outward, not inward. And yet, alternative theories never fully disappeared. There's something seductive about mystery. The idea that a lost civilization might hold secret knowledge, hidden technology, or connections to forgotten worlds is comforting in its drama. It turns uncertainty into spectacle. It transforms quiet human effort into grand myth. The Olmecs, however, resist spectacle. Their world does not reveal sudden miracles or impossible feats. It reveals patience, cooperation, and adaptation. Their achievements become more impressive, not less, when understood within human limits. Misunderstandings also arose from interpreting Olmec beliefs through modern categories. Gods were sometimes labeled simplistically. Rituals were described as obsession with violence rather than balance. Sacrifice was isolated from its context and exaggerated into defining identity. These interpretations flattened complexity into caricature. Over time, scholarship corrected many of these distortions, but traces remain in popular culture. The Olmecs are still sometimes portrayed as enigmatic precursors with hidden powers rather than as a living society responding to its environment. Even within academic circles, debates continue, not about whether the Olmecs existed or where they came from, but about the details of their influence. How centralized was their power? How uniform were their beliefs across regions? Did they have writing or only symbolic systems? Were they truly the first or simply the most visible? These debates are healthy. They reflect an evolving understanding rather than fixed doctrine. What matters is not reaching a final answer, but refining the questions. Modern theories grounded in evidence paint a quieter picture. The Olmecs were innovators, but not isolated geniuses. They built upon earlier traditions and influenced later ones. Their society was complex, but not uniform. Power shifted. Beliefs adapted. Their world changed over time. This view lacks the drama of lost continents or vanished super-civilizations, but it carries something deeper: respect. Respect for human ingenuity that does not rely on mystery. Respect for cultures that develop complexity without needing to resemble modern societies. Respect for uncertainty where evidence ends. The Olmecs also remind us of how modern desires shape interpretation. We often want the past to be extraordinary in ways that confirm our sense of wonder, but the truth is often quieter, more subtle, and no less meaningful. Consider how the idea of the Olmecs as a mother culture has itself been questioned. While their influence is undeniable, calling them the single origin risks oversimplifying a region rich with interaction and shared development. It implies hierarchy where collaboration may be more accurate. The reality is messier and more interesting. Multiple cultures contributed to Mesoamerican civilization. The Olmecs were early, influential participants, not solitary founders. Their ideas spread because they worked, not because they dominated. This shift in perspective reflects a broader change in how archaeology approaches the past. Rather than searching for firsts and origins alone, it now looks for networks, exchanges, and shared innovation. History becomes a web rather than a line. The Olmecs fit beautifully into this web. They connect early agricultural communities to later city-states. They bridge practical survival and symbolic thought. They stand at a moment when human organization became more layered without becoming rigid. Modern technology continues to refine understanding, but it also humbles it. New discoveries often complicate rather than resolve debates. What once seemed clear becomes nuanced. What once seemed certain becomes provisional. This uncertainty is not failure. It is honesty. The Olmecs cannot speak to correct our interpretations. They left no written rebuttal to speculation. Their silence demands restraint. It asks us to resist filling gaps too eagerly, to accept that some questions remain unanswered. There is a particular calm in this acceptance. In acknowledging what we do not know, we leave space for the past to remain itself rather than being reshaped to suit modern imagination. As you sit with these competing theories and evolving understandings, notice how they reveal as much about the present as the past. Every generation interprets history through its own lens. The Olmecs become a reflection of changing values, assumptions, and curiosities. What endures is not any single explanation, but the presence of the Olmecs themselves, stone faces, buried offerings, subtle alignments, unchanged by the stories told about them. They wait patiently as interpretations come and go. Perhaps this is the final lesson of the Olmecs' rediscovery and reinterpretation. Not that the past hides secrets waiting to be uncovered, but that understanding is a relationship, not a conquest. It requires listening, patience, and humility. The Olmecs do not demand to be explained. They exist, and in their quiet persistence, they remind us that mystery is not something to eliminate, but something to live alongside. In allowing the Olmecs to remain partially unknown, we honor their humanity. We accept that their world was complete without our understanding. And in doing so, we learn to approach history not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a presence to be respected, calm, distant, and still watching as the centuries continue past. When the Olmecs are spoken of today, it is often in the language of loss, a vanished civilization, a forgotten people, a world reclaimed by jungle and time. But this framing misses something essential. The Olmecs did not disappear without leaving anything behind. They left traces that moved forward quietly, shaping worlds they would never see. Their legacy is not contained in ruins alone. It lives in ideas, patterns, and ways of understanding that continued long after their cities grew silent. What the Olmecs left behind was not a single invention or monument that can be neatly summarized. It was a way of organizing meaning. They demonstrated that human communities could coordinate large-scale effort without rigid militarism, that leadership could be spiritual as well as practical, that belief could be woven into daily life rather than separated from it. These were not small contributions. They shaped the foundation of Mesoamerican civilization. Later societies built grander cities, wrote longer histories, and left more visible ruins. But many of their core assumptions about power, ritual, time, and balance echo earlier Olmec choices. Sacred centers remained central to social life. Rulers continued to be seen as mediators rather than mere administrators. Ritual retained its role as a means of maintaining harmony rather than asserting dominance. The Olmec understanding of nature as an active participant rather than a passive resource persisted across centuries. Crops were still planted with ceremony. Rain was still prayed for rather than demanded. The earth remained sacred, capable of giving and taking in equal measure. This worldview influenced how later cultures responded to crisis, abundance, and change. Artistic legacy is perhaps the most visible thread. The Olmecs showed that art could carry authority without violence. Their monumental faces did not threaten. They endured. Later cultures adopted this emphasis on symbolic presence. Even when art became more intricate, the idea that imagery could embody power rather than illustrate it remained. Symbolism developed by the Olmecs continued to evolve. The jaguar remained central. The blending of human and animal identities persisted as a way of expressing transformation and connection to the unseen. These motifs did not stagnate. They adapted to new environments and beliefs, demonstrating the flexibility of the original concepts. The Olmecs also left behind pathways of interaction. Trade networks they helped establish outlived their political centers. Routes of exchange became routes of influence. Through these channels, materials, ideas, and practices continued to circulate, contributing to the region's shared cultural fabric. Even the Olmec approach to impermanence left a mark. Their willingness to let centers fade rather than force continuity at all costs set a precedent. Later societies, while more monumental in some ways, still understood that cycles of renewal and decline were natural. Endings did not always require catastrophe. From a modern perspective, this legacy challenges how we measure success. The Olmecs did not build an empire that endured for millennia. They did not leave extensive written records to secure their place in history. And yet, their influence proved durable precisely because it was adaptable. Ideas that can change survive longer than structures that cannot. The Olmecs also leave behind a lesson about visibility. They remind us that impact does not require recognition, that a culture can shape the future without being remembered by name. This challenges modern assumptions about legacy, which often prioritize fame and permanence. Their story invites humility. It asks us to consider how much of what we inherit comes from sources we no longer recognize. how many unnamed contributors shape the world we live in, how much of human achievement is collective, cumulative, and unrecorded. For scholars and listeners alike, the Olmecs encourage a slower approach to history, one that values context over conclusions, patience over certainty. Their world cannot be reduced to a checklist of achievements. It must be felt as a process of growth, adaptation, and transformation. In this sense, the Olmecs are not distant ancestors to be admired from afar. They are participants in an ongoing human story. Their responses to uncertainty, environmental change, and social complexity mirror challenges faced by societies today. They lived in a world where balance was fragile, where nature could not be controlled, where survival depended on cooperation and restraint. These conditions feel increasingly familiar. The Olmec emphasis on harmony rather than dominance offers perspective worth revisiting. Their monuments, when encountered now, do not overwhelm with scale alone. They invite reflection. They ask us to consider who we choose to honor, what we choose to preserve, and how we understand power. The calm expressions carved into stone feel deliberate, even now, as if reminding viewers that endurance does not require aggression. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Olmecs is their quiet confidence. They did not rush to explain themselves. They did not inscribe their achievements for eternity. They trusted that what mattered would persist, even if names and places were lost. In a world obsessed with documentation and visibility, this trust feels radical. As you sit with their story, consider what it means to leave something behind. Not objects alone, but ways of thinking, relating, and responding to the world. The Olmecs left behind a model of civilization that valued balance, connection, and adaptability. That model, reshaped countless times, continues to echo. Their lost world is not truly lost. It is dispersed, woven into the cultural DNA of a region, embedded in ideas that survive because they could change. The jungle may have reclaimed their cities, but it could not reclaim their influence. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson they offer, that even when visible traces fade, what is lived deeply can travel far. That legacy is not always a monument standing alone against time, but a quiet current moving forward, unseen, shaping everything it touches. When people speak of the Olmecs today, they often focus on what is missing, the cities swallowed by jungle, the voices that never wrote their names, the stories that ended without explanation. But absence is only one way to measure legacy, and it is not always the most honest one. What the Olmecs left behind cannot be gathered into a single artifact or summarized in a list of accomplishments. It survives instead as an influence, subtle, dispersed, and deeply rooted in the civilizations that followed. The Olmecs demonstrated, long before it became common, that human societies could organize around shared belief rather than constant force. Their centers were not fortified by walls or dominated by armies. They were anchored by ritual, symbolism, and cooperation. Leadership emerged through responsibility and spiritual authority as much as through power. This approach shaped later Mesoamerican societies, where rulers were expected not only to govern, but to maintain balance between worlds. Their understanding of the land as a living participant rather than a resource to be controlled left a lasting impression. Nature was never something to dominate. It was something to listen to. Rain, soil, and seasons were treated with reverence because survival depended on respect rather than conquest. This worldview persisted across centuries, influencing agricultural practices, ritual calendars, and responses to environmental change. In art, the Olmecs left behind a language of presence rather than spectacle. Their colossal heads do not tell stories. They do not celebrate victories. They simply exist, calm and immovable. This idea that authority can be expressed through restraint echoes through later Mesoamerican art, where symbolism often carried more weight than realism. Power was not loud. It was embodied. Symbolic continuity is one of the clearest threads connecting the Olmecs to later cultures. The jaguar, the blending of human and animal forms, the emphasis on transformation and liminality. All of these ideas appear again and again, reshaped but recognizable. They endured not because they were enforced, but because they resonated with shared human experience. Trade networks the Olmecs helped establish extended far beyond their own centers. These routes did more than move materials. They moved ideas. Through them, artistic styles, religious concepts, and social practices traveled quietly, influencing regions that never knew the Olmecs directly. In this way, their world expanded even as their political centers faded. Perhaps most striking is what the Olmecs did not insist upon. They did not attempt to preserve their cities at all costs. They did not cling to permanence as a measure of success. When conditions changed, they adapted, dispersed, and allowed the land to reclaim what no longer served its purpose. This acceptance of impermanence became part of their legacy as well. Later civilizations, though often more monumental, inherited this understanding of cycles. Renewal mattered more than endless expansion. Endings did not always signal failure. They marked transition. This perspective shaped how societies responded to decline and change, allowing culture to continue even when cities fell. From a modern point of view, the Olmecs challenge the idea that history belongs only to those who leave written records. They remind us that memory can persist without text, that influence can travel without attribution, and that a culture does not need to be named to matter. Their story also complicates the idea of progress. The Olmecs were not primitive ancestors waiting to be surpassed. They were innovators responding intelligently to their world. Their solutions were suited to their environment and values, not to future expectations. In this way, their achievements stand on their own, independent of what came later. The Olmecs encourage a different way of looking at the past, one that values relationships over hierarchies, adaptation over permanence, and humility over dominance. These values feel especially relevant in a world facing environmental uncertainty and social complexity. Their monuments, when encountered today, do not offer clear answers. They invite stillness. They ask viewers to slow down, to consider time on a scale that makes modern urgency feel small. In their silence, they remind us that endurance does not always announce itself. Perhaps the greatest thing the Olmecs left behind is a reminder that legacy is not something we control. It emerges from how deeply we live, how thoughtfully we respond to our world, and how willing we are to let change reshape us. They trusted that what mattered would endure, even if no one remembered their names. Their world was not lost in the way we often imagine. It was transformed, dispersed, and absorbed into the fabric of human history. The jungle reclaimed their cities, but it could not reclaim the ideas that had already taken root. And so, the Olmecs remain quietly present, woven into the foundations of civilizations that followed, and still offering, through stone and silence, a lesson in balance, resilience, and the power of living fully within one's time.